200 years ago, in 1822, Ludwig van Beethoven published his final piano sonata. It's a monumental piece. It's one of the pinnacles of human achievement. All human emotion is there, from volcanic intensity to a kind of resigned, sublime acceptance. I dream of playing that sonata. There is a theory that if you do something for 10,000 hours, you master it. It's complete bullshit. I had my first piano lesson 60 years ago this month. At a conservative estimate, I reckon I've put in about averaged about half an hour's piano playing every day for the last 60 years. That comes to just over 10,000 hours. I am not a concert pianist. I am never probably going to play Beethoven's last piano sonata. We have to accept we are not all going to be world-class performers. But that doesn't matter. That doesn't mean we don't all have some talent. It doesn't mean that we don't have a sense of curiosity, a desire to explore, a desire to surprise ourselves when we follow a particular path and see where it leads us. Well, in my case, that path has been the slightly esoteric path of mountaineering. And you might say, why? Why not? Climbing is fun. There's the sheer physical joy of movement through steep places, the closest I'm likely ever to get to dancing. And there's a narrative, whether you're in the Alps, following in the steps of that great pioneer, Gertrude Bell, who was the first person ever to attempt this great North Wall back in 1902, or whether you're creating your own line, as we did on the first ascent of this previously unclimbed peak in the Himalayas, literally living, working, and sleeping on the mountain continuously for 7 days. And for me, there's the pleasure, the excitement of going to very remote places, like, for instance, the island of South Georgia on the edge of Antarctica. I first went there in 1990, and it's the most beautiful place. The only indigenous inhabitants are a few million seals and penguins, and some magnificent mountains. We made the first ascent of a peak called Mount Kars, and one adventure tends to beget another. And from that summit, I couldn't help noticing a lovely, pointy little peak silhouetted against the setting sun. And I did some research and discovered it's called Starbuck Peak. Starbuck is the name of a well-known whaling dynasty. Well, I just made a mental note of that peak. And then 20 years later, I was back on South Georgia. I was leading a team on a ski traverse of the island. And lo and behold, we skied right beneath Starbuck Peak. And there it was again, this wonderful, pointy, inaccessible-looking peak. And I thought, it's got to be climbed. We've got to do something about this. So I sort of formulated a plan, and we went to attempt it. But getting to South Georgia is a serious business. You've got to sail 800 miles from the Falkland Islands. The conditions at times can be quite irksome, and it can be quite a trying journey. And so it's a big investment in time and effort and raising the money to pay for these trips. And then when you get there, quite often, it's more of the same as you get into the mountain interior. It can be a very frustrating business. And we tried in 2014. We didn't get anywhere near the mountain. We went back in 2016, and on the first day of our approach, we got hit by a blizzard. The blizzard lasted 4 days. The blizzard, like all blizzards, eventually came to an end. And after 4 days, there it was, that obscure object of my rather perverse desires, this unclimbed, pointy peak on this remote island in the Southern Ocean. And up there, was this tenuous ramp line, which I'd been wondering about all those years. And a day later, we were making our way up that ramp, 5 of us heading towards the summit, rewarded with an afternoon of just the most glorious luminosity as we emerged onto the final ridge leading to the summit. Leadership is all about surrounding yourself by good people. Nota bene, Mr. Johnson. Everest, the world's highest mountain, was rather different. It happened almost by accident. I didn't plan to go to Everest. There were always too many other more interesting mountains to explore. This is a man called John Hunt, who was the leader of the first ascent of Everest in 1953. And it was thanks to him that I got my chance to go to Everest 35 years after the first ascent and to get a new watch. And I was invited to join an American team. Now, you've probably heard and read about recent events on the world's highest mountain. You've probably heard tales of endless lines of people being shepherded up to the summit and back down again. This was rather different. Just 4 of us. There were going to be no high-altitude porters working for us on the mountain. We were going to be carrying everything ourselves. That meant we couldn't take heavy oxygen equipment. We were going, and this was the scary bit, we were going to the east face, the biggest face on the mountain, the Kangshung face. It had a tremendous reputation. It had only been climbed once before, and we were going to try a new route. And this, I suppose, was typical of the reaction of the world's mountaineering experts as they heard us say what we were going to try and do. Not very encouraging. And that's what we thought of that. Of course, we knew this was a tall order. Of course, we knew that the Kangshung face was potentially very dangerous. We knew we probably wouldn't succeed. I reckoned we had maybe a 10% chance of getting up this thing, certainly of getting to the summit. But that's the whole point. It was the uncertainty of the whole venture that made it appealing. The sense of risk, the sense of curiosity. Let's just go and see what it's like. Let's see if we might actually pull this thing off. I said no high-altitude porters, no porters on the mountain. But of course, we needed help to get to the mountain. We had getting on for a ton of supplies and equipment, and we were totally reliant on these local people struggling bravely through very difficult conditions just to get us to our base camp at the foot of the mountain. It took 23 days to make a journey of just about 30 miles, but eventually we arrived at the chosen site for our base camp. Here's our leader, Robert, with Pasang, our expedition cook, organizing the paying of all the porters, who were then very relieved they could all go back home, and we could settle into what would be home for the next 2 months. Base camp was at about 5,000 meters above sea level, but we spent most of our time actually higher up at what we called advanced base, immediately beneath this great east face of Everest. And there, immediately above us, was 3,500 meter high wall of Everest. What does that mean, 3,500 meters? How do you begin to convey scale in a photo? It's very hard. So I've put the Empire State Building, which when I was a child was, I believe, still the tallest building in the world. I've stuck that down at the start of our proposed new route up the east face of Everest. The route was long, intricate, technical, difficult, grueling, very hard, very complex. And so we worked away at it day by day, going up and down the mountain, usually starting before dawn with an early breakfast, that hideous business of getting up in the dark, getting out of your sleeping bag at 3 o'clock in the morning, going off to work, but being rewarded by the most glorious sunrise on a fine day and the thrill of going where no human being has ever been before. The climbing was continually interesting, intricate. We were just totally immersed in this, totally involved in what we were doing, sharing the leads between the 4 of us, just thrilled to be in this extraordinary vertical scenery, moving through the most stupendous features on the mountain. And just a real sense of, wow, look where we are. Woo! My God, here we are, 2,000, 3,000 feet up these great ice towers, staring down at the crevasses of the Kangshung Glacier. And just a sense of, yes, I think this thing's working. What a fine anchor Ed has built there. Now, of course, there were days when the weather was not good. We were confined to our tents. There were rest days. There were days down at Advanced Base Camp reading, keeping up our diaries, feeding, very important, stoking the body. Days to build a snow woman, to keep ourselves amused. And days back at base camp, enjoying the company of our doctor, our expedition doctor, Mimi Zeman, and our expedition photographer, Joe Blackburn. Well, over a period of 4 to 5 weeks, we worked our route. We established 2 camps on the mountain, and then here we are, finally setting off on our summit push. Ed here, arriving at Camp 2 after a 14 hours slog from Camp 1. And then the next day, carrying everything on our backs, tents, stoves, sleeping bags, gas, food, arriving at the desolate South Col. At that altitude, everything just gets very, very difficult. Temperatures down to generally about minus 30, and this is in May. The only way you get liquid is by melting ice and snow on a gas stove. The atmosphere up here has only a third of the pressure it has here in Oxford. It's very, very hard to get anything into your lungs. You're desperately working your diaphragm, trying to get some precious oxygen into your lungs. Paul Tier felt so unwell that in the morning he decided he was going to go back down, leaving just 3 of us to see if we could have a crack at the summit. We knew it was risky. We knew that at that stage, 20 people had reached the summit of Everest without using supplementary oxygen. 4 of them had not come back. I came recently across this quote: "Life is impoverished. It loses interest when the highest stake in the game, life itself, may not be risked." An extreme view, perhaps. And I don't want to suggest that we were going willfully throwing away our lives. But there are occasions when perhaps you have to put your head on the block. You have to say, this is a great project. I'm prepared to accept a level of risk. Of course, we're going to try and do this safely. Of course, we're going to do it as well as we can. And we have every intention of coming back alive. But there is an unavoidable level of risk that has to be accepted. And above all, our leader, Robert, the great thing about Robert was he took the biggest risk of all, not risking his life, but the risk of saying, hey, let's go and climb the Kangxing face of Everest with just 4 of us by a new route. That's the really brave thing, that actually instigating this crazy project in the first place and trusting us to join him on that journey. And from the outset, making it quite clear that between the 4 of us, there was total equality of esteem. This was pure democracy in action. Well, Paul went down, we hung in there. It was very windy, but that evening the wind dropped, and at 11 o'clock that night, we set off to see if we could climb to the summit, thinking we probably couldn't, but let's give it a go. And it was an extraordinary sensation, setting off in the dark, in the bitter cold, in just the clothes we were wearing, each isolated in a little pool of torchlight, struggling up in the darkness. I found initially I could make 20 steps before I had to stop and have a rest. As the night wore on, it got down to 10 steps, and then 3 steps, and then 2 steps. And I'm talking about working your diaphragm so that you're taking 3, 4, maybe even 5 breaths to every step, trying to do something the human body really wasn't designed to do, which is to exist at close to the height at which jet airplanes fly, where there is really very, very little air to breathe. But then there's the wonderful, heartwarming thrill of seeing sunrise over Tibet and giving you new hope and a sense of possibility. However, it was very, very hard work. I think each of the 3 of us pushed ourselves to the limit and beyond the limit. Well, I'm glad to say all 3 of us made it to the south summit of Mount Everest, higher than any other summit on Earth. Sadly, Robert and Ed both got there so late in the day that the weather was clagged in, they couldn't even see the final ridge leading to the main summit. It was nearly nightfall, and they had no choice but to turn round. I got there slightly earlier in the afternoon. I was able to continue and take this picture looking up at the famous Hillary Step, the final sort of sting in the tail before you get to the main summit of Everest itself. And I reached the summit at 20 to 4 in the afternoon, very late, having told myself that 4 o'clock was the absolute final turnaround point. So there I was, alone on top of the world, with some old empty oxygen cylinders and some prayer flags attached to those cylinders. And then it was time almost immediately to turn around. I was struggling to get back down. Darkness fell. I ended up having to spend a night out in the open at 28,000 feet, 8,600 meters above sea level. I think it was a record. I don't think anyone had ever spent a night alone in the open at that altitude before. But hey, someone's got to do it. I was lucky. There was no wind that night. I did get desperately cold, but I survived. The happiest moment of all, though, was rejoining Ed and Robert, who'd also been caught out and benighted slightly lower down. It took us a full 3 days to drag our increasingly weary bodies all the way back down the east face. We had pushed ourselves, as I said, to the limit and beyond the limit. Some would say we'd pushed ourselves dangerously far, and perhaps they're right. So we had a real struggle getting back down. But the euphoria, the deep, lasting sense of fulfillment when we did get back down, because that's the greatest moment of all, when you step back down onto flat Earth, that was utterly thrilling. So there we are, Robert, Ed, and myself with our doctor, Mimi. And the wise one, the brave one, who turned around early, who was undamaged, Paul Tier, photographed here 20 years later in California. We pushed ourselves hard, we paid the price. Poor old Ed lost some fingertips from frostbite. I lost 3.5 toes, which is a price I'm perfectly happy to pay. I'm glad to say I didn't lose any fingertips. So who knows, maybe one day I might manage to play that final Beethoven piano sonata. Thank you.